Hello and welcome to the Toolkit for Traders YouTube channel, where we give you the tools for trading success. And we're on to the fourth episode of this MQL5 programming tutorial series. So let's get into it. So in this episode, we're continuing to look at our coding building blocks, looking at the basic blocks of what we need to know to be able to code in MQL5 and make our expert advisors. So in today's video, we'll be continuing on from the last video where we looked at variables, and we will recap on those. We'll be looking at functions and how they are similar to factories. We'll use that analogy to help understand what functions are and how they work. And we'll also then go back to variables and look at scope for variables, which we'll be looking at global and local scope in variables. So let's get started. So the quote for today's lesson: computer science is not just for smart nerds in hoodies coding in basements. Coding is extremely creative and is an integral part of almost every industry. And that's Reshma Saujani. And I think that's really true. This is a creative thing. And when you're making expert advisors, it will get your creative juices going. And if you want to stay ahead of this game, you need to be a creative person to think of new ways to extract alpha from the market, because you'll unlikely to do that by doing algorithms that you find on baby pips. So we'll do a recap on variables, and we'll look at how they're like storage containers, as you see the box on the screen. So variables are storage containers on your computer to hold important information. It's how your computer will store bits of information for you. In a labeled container. Imagine a box going onto a shelf with a label on it, so you know what's inside that box with the label telling you what the name of the bit of data you've got in there, and you'll also have the type of data on there. So variables have to be a specific type, and type being a key word there, depending on the data they hold. The main kinds of data that we look at, and we looked at in the last lesson, are double for numbers with a decimal place, like price; int or integers for discrete whole numbers with no decimal places, like counting the number of trades you've taken or holding your trade ticket number; string to hold text between double speech marks for information that you might want to share with the computer, such as error messages or trade success messages, things like that; and then bool, which is short for boolean, which can hold true or false. So good for testing, if this is true, we take a trade; if it's false, we don't. That kind of thing. There are others, but they're the main ones that you will use when constructing your expert advisors. Variables then have to be named, and it's useful to use a name that makes sense to you. So when you're looking back at the names of those variables, and you're looking back at your code, you understand what that variable is and why you've stored it. If you just put my variable 1, it doesn't tell you very much information about what that variable is storing. But if you give it a name like moving average number, that contains the number of the moving average at a specific point, that is telling you what that variable holds. Once you've typed and declared the variable, you can then use it. So as an example here, we've got a string, which is a text type. We declare that first. Then we give the variable a name, and you see the variable's name is here. So we give it a name that makes sense. So we've called this one my name, and we've used a camel case here. So we've got the words are separated by a capital letter in the middle. You can use any convention with that, but I tend to use camel case. You could separate words with underscores, things like that. You can't separate them with spaces. So, and then you set using the equal sign here, and we've given the name Alistair in between the speech marks and ended with a semicolon. So there's variables. Just a quick recap on that. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, go back to the last video, have a rewatch of that, and do the exercise that came at the end of the episode to get familiar with variables. We're now going to look at the next building block, which is functions. And I want to share an analogy which compares functions to factories to help you understand what functions do. So a factory is a place that takes in a raw material, right? So a factory takes in a raw material, it completes a process, does something with that material, and then produces an output which is more useful for us. So in the case of a steel factory, let's say you might have inputs coming in, which might be your coal, might be your iron ore. There are obviously many other inputs that go into making steel, but just for this analogy, we take two inputs, our raw materials, which we put in. The steel factory, the process, does something with those materials and eventually comes out with an output, which is your steel or bars or whatever shape that might be. But the point here is that you have an input, and notice that I've put the input on the right hand side rather than normal left. We've got the process in factory, and then we've got the output on the left hand side. So that's the flow that when we're using functions, we'll generally use. But think of it that a function, you put your inputs in and you get an output out that you've already predetermined. So a function is a block of code that takes input variables and produces an output. So as an example, we might create a function that's going to calculate the spread for us. Now, this is a very simple calculation to do, and there'll be packages, and you could do it in other ways. But if you wanted to create your own function, you could create one that calculates spread. So very, very simple. So in order to calculate the spread, we need to put into that factory our inputs. And to calculate spread, there's two very basic inputs we need. We need the bid price and we need the ask price. So in order to put those in code terms, we need to put them as parameters. Parameters is another word for inputs for that specific function. And we could give it the name, we would have two doubles because the price for bid and ask will be prices, which are numbers with decimal places. And we could give it P1 and P2 as parameters. However, P1 and P2 isn't that useful for us. It's useful to use things that make sense to us, help the code be readable. So we could give those input names as bid and ask, which we've done down here. So that's a good way to do it, and that helps us to make the code readable. We then have a return or an output that comes from our factory, our function, and that is the spread. So how do we get that spread out of the factory in terms of code and our function? So the first thing we need to do when we define our function is we need to say what the output is going to be, what kind of data, just like the variables where we were given a type, whether it's going to be string, integer, double, bool, or another. We also need to do this for the function output so that the code knows what to expect when that function is processed. And in this case, in spread is also going to be a number with a decimal place. It would be a difference in price. So we're going to get a double out of it. So we declare that we're going to have a double coming out. Our function is going to be called calculate spread, and our inputs are going to be two doubles, bid and ask. So to create a function, you simply need to do the following. You need to declare the type of variable that will be output, as in double string. And if no output is going to be returned, so if you're going to have a function, it's purely just going to do something, but not actually return out of it any data or any output, which we will cover later on, then you can use the word void, VOID. And that just tells the computer there's not any output. This function just purely does something internal that doesn't then need to be further processed down the line. So again, we have our function here that we've created with the output type double. The function is called calculate spread, and we have our inputs bid and ask. If we were to say that calculate spread was just a purely internal function that we don't need to use elsewhere, the output from that, we could put the word void in front of it just to say there's no output to be returned from there. So it's important when you create functions, you name your function something obvious and clear to you that makes sense and makes your code more readable. Because remember, when you're writing code, you're writing it for yourself or for others to read in a human readable way. So make sure it can be read by humans. The compiler will turn it into computer readable code. So that will sort all that out. So it's important that you give your code readable names and your functions readable names. So a good example is calculate spread. A bad example here is FCS 124694. Doesn't make any sense. You've no idea what that function is. That's a bad name for it. So do give your function names readable names, and you can make them quite long, if you want to explain what that function does. You can also use comments as well. It's a good practice to do that. So you need to tell the function what input type you're going to expect. So in this case, we've put the word double here in front of the bid, and we put the word double here in front of the ask. We're telling it that the inputs to this function are going to be of the double type. And that will mean that the compute, if you put input into your code, let's say a string and an integer into this function, the code will come up with an error warning, which will tell you that, hey, this is the wrong kind of data we were expecting. And that might be a typo that you've done or something that's a mistake. And that can be really useful for debugging your data. So that's one good reason why we put that information in front. And one thing I also like to do when I do my inputs is, because these are parameters, and when we use them, it's useful to separate them, say, from other variables we might have running in the code. I will put a P for parameter in front of the name. So we have P bid here and P ask. So it just means parameter bid, parameter ask. And again, that just helps. Again, I keep saying it, but we're just trying to make the code as readable as possible. So once you've, when you want to then make your function, you write your code within curly brackets, which you can see here and here. We don't put a semicolon at the end when we're declaring our function, and we put our code here. So whenever we call this function, it will run the code that is within the curly brackets. And remember, we don't use a semicolon here. We will use it for the code that's within the function, but at the end of the function declaration, we're not going to use that. We use instead these two curly brackets, which just show the start and the end of the script, which is run when that function is called. And finally, we want to get an output. So the way we get an output from our function is to use the return keyword. So we have our function name here. We have our curly brackets. In this case, we've got a really, really simple function, because all we're going to do is take the bid price from the ask price and return that. So we have the return keyword, which says when this function is called, return the ask and the bid. And actually what it should say here is p ask, p bid. So excuse me for that, but it should say p ask, p bid. It's going to take the two parameters. It's going to do the mathematical calculation and return the result out there. And that will be a double type, which we've already set out there. So I hope that makes sense. We're going to go to the meta editor now, and we're going to create that function in meta editor, and then we're going to upload that onto our MetaTrader and see how that works. Okay, so we're back on our MetaTrader, and I'm going to open up the meta editor platform. We'll click the IDE button here, or press F4 to do that. And we have our lesson for the last time, but we're going to start a new one here. We're going to expert advisor template, and we'll just click through this. We're going to give this the name, let's give this what it is, MQL5 lesson _4. We've got our name and the website on there. We'll click next. We don't want any of these again. So we've got a blank lesson, a blank template here from which to work from, like we did before. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a simple function which is going to calculate the spread for us and display that on the MetaTrader platform screen, so that we can see the spread in real time. Obviously, you can see this in the navigator window, but we're going to create a function here just to demonstrate a small bit of the power of functions. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our onTick function. So what the onTick function, so we're talking about functions now, a bit familiar with it, and you can see the onTick function is a function that has the type void, and it is an inbuilt function within MetaTrader, and it is called every time a new tick of price comes onto the chart. This function will get called. So that means any code we write within these two curly brackets, which we spoke about before, any code we write here will get run every single time that there is a new price, bid or ask on from our broker comes through to our MetaTrader platform. So that's a really useful function. Obviously, we have here on init function, which has a return type of int. So it gives us an integer value, which you can look up in the documentation. So if you were to click on it, highlight the whole thing and press F1, it will actually bring up the reference documentation for MQL5. And you can see here, if we have a look, we have the function, and it says this function is called when the init event occurs. It is used to initialize a running MQL5 program. So basically, whenever we upload and start an expert advisor on our MetaTrader platform, this function will get called. It has an int return type, so it's going to give us a number without a decimal place, and 0 means successful initialization. So you might create a test for that and do something when the value is not 0, and the other values are enumerated to be different kinds of responses, so you can do some debugging on that to find out what it is. But that's the init function. We've also got the onTick function, which again we can press F1 and we can see a bit of information about that. The new tick event is generated only for EAs upon receiving a new tick for a symbol on the chart that EA is attached to. So this gives us an indication. You can read this to understand more about what this function does, but it tells you that when a new information comes, for a new bit of information comes on the chart that the EA is attached to. So that's important, because if you're running your EA for multiple symbols, which you can do, and say you had it running on a Euro USD chart and you had new price information on the pound chart, this event wouldn't be called. It would only be called when there's new information on the Euro chart. Thankfully, though, ticks happen very, very frequently, so that's usually not a problem. And usually we actually want to slow down our expert advisors to only work when a new bar is printed, for instance. So usually not a problem. So anyway, back to where we were coding. So we're looking here at our onTick function, and we want to create a function here that is going to calculate spread. So we first need to define the function. So we can come underneath the onTick function here, and we want to say the type of the output we want, which in this case is a double. We want to give the name of our function, which is calculate spread. In this case, we're going to call it. We'll open the brackets and we'll say the type of our inputs, our parameters that are going to be there. So we're going to have the p bid, and we're going to have a double, which is p ask. We then need to create the curly brackets, which you can do straight after the line. That's a habit of mine, but MQL seems to like it when you do it in this format underneath. But the either's fine as long as you've got an open and a close, you'll be fine. It's good practice so when you start writing the function as well, put your brackets, both brackets there, make sure they're both there and right in between, because a lot of times you will forget to put the function there. So we can put a bit of comment here as well. We can say this is a function to calculate and return the spread. So that reminds us what this function does. Obviously, in this case, this is a very, very simple function. It's pretty obvious, but get into the habit of doing that. So we are going to create a variable within our function. This will be a local variable. So when we'll talk about scope in a moment, but when the function has run, this variable will disappear and will no longer be held. But we can create this to make it easier to work with the code that's within our function. So we'll create a equation, which is the ask minus the bid. So you can see here the helper has already understood we've got these parameters of input, so we probably want to use this. And if you were to start that again and you press tab, it will auto fill that out for you. So we'll start with that. We've got our ask minus our bid price, and then we can return this as spread. Of course, you could just return this, but this is a really common way of writing functions. And if you have something more complicated, more often than not, you will be returning a variable at the end rather than just the equation. So we'll set it out like this, different to how we did in the presentation. So now that we've done that, we can save that. But of course, this function is not going to do anything because we're not calling the function. A function will only run when you ask for it to be run. So this is where we come back to the onTick function. So here we want to write a bit of script that's going to call that function every time the tick is run. So we'll create another variable around again, and with this time we'll call it current spread. And you can see that actually if I was to write one, start writing spread, that function doesn't come up because this variable here is within these curly brackets, is within the scope of this function. It cannot be used up here in a different function. So we'll have a new variable with a different name just to help us understand that this is something slightly different. We can now call our function. You can see here it's come up in the helper, calculate spread, so we can press tab. And then we need to input here the current bid and the current ask price. And to get that from MetaTrader, we can use one of their inbuilt functions, which is symbol info double. So you can see here it's come up on the screen. Once I've typed in symbol, I can press enter on there and I'll get symbol info double. And that has parameters which it needs. So you can see when I've opened the brackets here, it's a return type double, symbol info double is the name, and it wants a string name, a string with the symbol name, as in Euro USD, and it wants the kind of property ID that we want. So if we just double click on that and we press the F1, which we did before, it'll bring up the documentation for the symbol info double. And you can scroll down here and you can see it will give us, it needs a symbol name like Euro USD or current symbol, and it needs an identifier of the symbol property. So there's multiple things that it can return. So we'll click on this enum symbol info double, and this will bring us all the information that we can now get from this symbol info double function. You can see all down here, they're all doubles, and we can get the bid, the ask, which is what we want here. We can also get the bid low, we can get the last low, we can get the volume real, we can get the point figure, we can get the swap figure, we can get the Wednesday swap, margin maintenance, etc., etc. There's lots of things you can get here, and there's also other functions which are symbol info integer and symbol info string, which we're not using in this case, so we won't look at that. But what we want is the symbol ask and the symbol bid, which are going to be returned as doubles. So we can close that. We'll come to there. Our first input is going to be our bid price. So we're going to type in symbol underscore bid. And we've got that wrong because you need the symbol first. So our current symbol is, we can just use an inbuilt variable within MetaTrader, which is an underscore followed by symbol. And that will basically use the symbol that the EA is attached to. So if it's on your USD, it will give you your USD. If you're on GBP, it will put that on there. So that's really useful because you don't then need to hard code the symbol in there. You can just use the current symbol that's on there. We've now got a few options, and we can see we want the bid. So we can go down to that, press return, and we've got the bid. We need a second parameter now, which is the ask. So that's much the same. So we'll just whiz through that. Again, we'll use the current symbol for that, a comma to separate this, to do parameters within this function, and we'll go down to the bid. So we now need to make sure we close that. So we've closed that function. So we had this function opened a curly bracket there, and then this function opened with a curly bracket, which we closed there. So we've got two curly brackets and a semicolon to close that. So we've now called that function. We have given it the parameters that it needs, and we'll now have a calculation. And the last thing we need to do is put this onto the screen. So we'll use the comment function, which we used in the last episode. We'll type in a spread message. In fact, we'll come back to that. So we could give it a message, the current spread is, and we'll leave a little space, and then we'll close that text statement. We'll separate that because we're going to a different type of text, a different type now, and we want to put our double in there, but we can't put a double straight in there because a double is a number, and we need this to be a string type for it to be displayed as text on string. So again, we can use an inbuilt function, double to string, which is in the meta editor already, so, and the MQL language. So we can use that function now. We want the double value, which in this case is our current spread. And then we also want to know how many digits of the double. So doubles can have multiple digits after the decimal place, and we're going to say 0 in this case because we want our spread to be nice and readable. So we can close that, and have we got enough? I think we've got enough. We've closed that one there. We've closed that one there. That looks about right. We'll press save and we'll compile. Excellent. So we now have our code generated with no errors, no warnings down at the bottom here. So now we can go over to MetaTrader. We can go to our expert advisors. We can find, if we can't find it, we'll have, there we go, our lesson 4. We'll drag that onto the screen. It's got no inputs at the moment. We'll untick algo trading. It doesn't do anything but at the moment, but just to be safe. And we'll load that on. And you can see the current spread is 0. So this has got, we're on Euro USD, and I don't know, the current spread is not 0 because if you look here, the bid and the ask is, they're separated by about 5 points, 0.5 of a pip. So there's something wrong here and that we've not done. So we need to go back into our meta editor, and it's something we need to understand about the spread. So when we're thinking about the spread price here, we're doing a calculation which is the bid price, the ask price, minus the bid price. Now those prices are 1 point something 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 minus 1 point something something something, right? So the result of that is going to be 0.00005. Okay, and when we said in up here that we our current spread should have no points after the decimal place, that means that it's going to get rid of that little tiny little bit of spread within our within our prices. So what we want to do, and the way we normally read spread is much more like an integer, so it's a number of points that are different between the two prices. So we need to basically times our spread figure that we get here by 10,000 in the case of Euro USD to bring that up to a number that makes sense to us. So one way we can do that, rather than times it by 10,000, because if you do that, then it won't work for USD JPY, for instance, which has fewer numbers after the decimal place. So what we can do is we can divide here by an inbuilt variable called point. Now you could get this from the symbol info double, but what point is it tells you, and we'll have a look here in the MQL5 reference, the point variable contains the point size of the current symbol of the quote currency. You can also use the point function. So this basically gives you a number which tells you what the smallest point is on that chart. So if we look back over to MetaTrader here and you look at the price, the smallest increment here is 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros and 0.1 after the decimal there. So 0.00001 is the smallest, and that's the smallest point on this symbol. If we were to add another symbol, let's look at your USD JPY, for instance, and bring that onto the chart, you can see that that's only got 3 numbers after the decimal place. So that will give us a different number. So we can show that actually in our in our EA here in a moment to make that more clear. So we'll divide it by this number point, and that's going to have the effect of multiplying by 10,000 because we're dividing by 0.00001, and then it will become a number that makes sense to us. So we'll do that, and then what we'll do here is after we've done that, we will add in a new line to our comment, and then we'll just put in a point size is, and we'll put a comma here, and we'll have a space, and we'll use the variable, and again we'll use double to string. We'll use the value of point, and we'll say, and we want it to be, let's say 5. Let's see if that works. I tell you what, yeah, we'll go with that. So we'll make sure that's all closed off. We'll save that. Do we get any errors? No, huzzah. So now we can go back to our meta editor and see if we've got something that makes more sense. So we've got our point value 0.0001. Our current spread is still showing as 0. So again, we've still got something not quite right with that. So the error we've made here, why we're getting 0, is because I've been a silly boy and we've put in two of the same parameters. So we're minusing effectively the bid minus the bid. So although we've got different names down here, our inputs are the same. So we need to put in our bid on the first one and our ask on the second one. So we do that here, and we can then return this to what it was, compile that, go to our MetaTrader, and we should get a new value when we get a new tick in. So there we go. So we've had a new tick and the current spread is now showing as 4. So now you've got a handy little expert advisor which will tell you the point size on your current chart, and it will also tell you the spread. Hey, it's not that useful, but it's an EA and it is doing something that's a bit clever, and it's using functions. So we've learned something today. So just wanted to recap over something else we spoke about when we were looking at the meta editor there, and that was local and global variables. So we've spoken about variables and the types and the names and what they do, but there's also the scope of variables, which is really important. And the two main scopes you need to understand are global and local. And we'll talk about that now. So global variables, usually you declare these at the start of the code, and they can be accessed by any and all of the subsequent code. So you put your global variables at the start, and then they can be used anywhere in the code. So inputs are a good example of global variables. They are a special type of global variable, but we put in the input, which might be the period of our simple moving average or something like that, and then we can use that period further down in the code. We can just call back to that variable for, I say, we call it MA period. We can call that variable further down the code. And so it's useful for holding key information that all of your EA needs, like order tickets, magic numbers, which differentiate between different EAs that you might have running, trade direction. You might have a global variable which says, well, bias is long or bias is short. And that might be Boolean or something like that to be true or false. And a good habit that I like to use is to prefix, like we did with the parameters going into our functions, prefix your global variables with a small g to distinguish it from anything else, like G order ticket. In this instance, we have a global variable which is going to hold our order ticket number, and it's a global variable, so we put the letter G in front of it to say that it's global. So that helps to keep our code clean and easy to read. Local variables, which we use with our calculate spread expert advisor that we just made, we created a local variable called a double called spread, and we created that within the function script that we created within the curly brackets for the calculate spread function. And so when that calculate spread function has run, that variable we created, it disappears until that function is run again, in which case the variable is recreated. So once the function is run through its list of instructions, the local variable is deleted and cannot be used. And that's why we pass input variables into our functions and return output variables at the end, because the variables that are created within the function disappear once the function is run. So we put variables in, we get a variable out, we get multiple variables out, and the variables that we created in between to help us manage the code and to do the code are gone. And so that's why we do that. So that in our next video, we're going to recap on functions, go through the exercise we had today, recreate the spread EA that we created today. I know it's simple. I know you'll not use it to make £1 million, but it will be useful for you to get the practice of writing your own EAs. And also you'll come across errors as you write them, and you'll have to find ways to try and fix it. In the next lesson, we're going to recap on those functions again, but we're going to start to use logic in our EAs, so we can use an if-else logic statement. So we can say, if this is the case, we'll do this, and if this is the case, we'll do that. And we'll see how that works in MQL. And we're going to start to make our spread EA a little bit more useful than what it is now. Again, it's not going to be a big hit in the next lesson, and you're not going to be able to load it up onto your prop firm account, but it will give us some useful feedback, automatic feedback to our MetaTrader terminal. So if you have any questions, you come up any issues recreating the spread EA that we created today, drop a comment in the section below, in the comment section below, and I'll try to answer it. And if you like this video, like the content I'm doing, please encourage me, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and put a comment there. Even if the comment is just, I like this video, that's good for me. It's really positive feedback and helps me to create better videos in the future. And that's all for now. We'll see you in the next lesson. Good trading.